What we're going to be going over here is manufacturing fixed overhead costs and variances, and we're going to be looking at the volume variance here for planned and unplanned production, and we're going to be calculating that. So what we're going to be looking at here, we're going to be tracing this fixed overhead cost through some T accounts here, along with their associated formulas. So we'll start with our actual fixed cost here, and we're going to move them into a fixed overhead control account. Actually, it's a manufacturing overhead control account. And we're going to be looking at here is we're going to take the original budgeted based amount here for some direct labor dollars for our fixed overhead, and we're going to be comparing it to some standard fixed overhead based on some planned production. And then remove this these fixed overhead control account. We're going to move those amounts into a work in process control account here. And it's going to be based on some standard costs. So what we're going to have here, we're going to have our standard costs here are going to be different than our actual cost, and that's where our variances come up. So based on that difference, we're going to come up with a fixed overhead spending variance, and then we're going to have a production volume variance here. But we're further going to break this production volume variance down between some planned production volume variance and the unplanned production volume variance. So before we get into our calculations, let's go over here. And we'll start out with this reference case. So in our equations here, I've got it marked in red, the key amounts here. So for our SVOR, that stands for the standard variable overhead rate. Actually, we're not going to be using that. But then we got SFOR, that would be our standard fixed overhead rate. And then AHU, those are the actual hours used. SHA, standard hours allowed. DH, those are the total budgeted direct hours for the period here. And those are referred to as the denominator hours because they are the denominator in our equation here to determine our standard fixed overhead rate. And then we have what they call the BH here, and that would be the budgeted hours for the planned production. So what we're talking about here for this fixed overhead rate, that we simply take our total fixed costs that we estimate for the period, and then we divide our total direct labor hours that we estimate for the period. So our total fixed cost we're looking at in this case was $240,000, and we have 4,800 total direct labor hours that we're looking at. So that is going to, division here is going to give us $50 per hour here for our fixed overhead costs, our fixed overhead costs. And you can look at it in terms of labor, our labor rate here, say, take our $50 per hour here, that fixed overhead rate here, $50 divided by a standard labor rate here, say $15 per hour. So what you're going to get here is 333%. So for every direct hour of labor that we spent, 333% is going to be included here as a fixed cost, a fixed labor rate, our fixed cost, overhead cost here. So we're really working with budgeted amounts and per hour rates when we're dealing with it. Just so we understand, quite often you deal with these percentages here when you're talking about standard fixed overhead rates here. All right, so that's what we're talking about. Okay, so now let's move over to our problem. Okay, so here's the case here. We're going to start with our actual fixed overhead cost for the period here at $242,500. Now, this is the case here we're going to be looking, we'll start out here with that $240,000. We're going to move into our fixed overhead control account. And that's simply taking, this is where the original budget based on our budgeted direct labor dollars here. Those total hours, our total hours that we were looking, direct labor hours, excuse me. So we were talking about, in this case, we had that standard fixed overhead rate here of $50 times those our total hours here, total budgeted labor hours here of 4,800 hours. So that amount here, $50 times 4,800 is going to give us $240,000. And then for our looking at our standard fixed overhead based on our planned production. So this is the case where you're going to take your standard fixed overhead rate here of $50 and take it times that the budgeted hours that we planned for the period here. We budgeted for our planned production 4,420 hours. So $50 times that amount is going to give us this fixed overhead for our planned production at $221,000. Okay, so we have a difference here between our original budgeted for those total direct labor hours versus what we have for our planned production. And then we would, for our work, it could move into our work in process account here. It's going to come in at the standard cost. And that's simply our standard fixed overhead rate here, $50 per hour, times the standard hours allowed here. Those are for our standard costing here. We're only allowing 4,000 hours here. So that amount gives us 200,000 here in our work in process. So you can see we have a difference here between our standard cost of 200,000 and our actual cost here at 242,500. So this is where we come up with our variances here. So that's going to be broken down here where we have our fixed overhead spending variance. And we're going to calculate that here. This is, you take your actual amount, the $242,500 here, and you subtract or you compare it to your budgeted amount here. And that was that standard fixed overhead rate here of $50 per hour times those denominator hours. So there's total budgeted direct labor hours here of 4,800 hours. That will give us 240,000. So the difference here is $2,500, which you're going to debit to your spending variance as an unfavorable amount, because your actual amount here, $242,500, is greater than your budgeted amount here of $240,000. So you're over budget. So when you have these unfavorable amounts, you have to debit them in that account. Okay, so we've taken care of our spending variance. Now let's go over to our production volume variance. And that we simply take by looking at those total denominator hours here, 4,800 hours, and compare them to the standard hours allowed here for our standard cost for the period here. And that was 4,000 hours. So 4,800, we have 800 additional hours here, our greater hours for those denominator hours, our total budgeted direct labor hours are greater by 800 versus the standard hours allowed of 4,000. So what we would do in this case, we just take those 800 hours here times the standard fixed overhead rate of $50. That's going to give us our production volume variance here at 40,000. So again, unfavorable because you've got the total budgeted hours here are 800 greater than the standard hours allowed. Okay, so unfavorable. So we've really accounted for that variance here, the 242,500, looking at it as a credit here compared to our work in process standard cost of 200,000. And if you look at it in debits and credits, you look at your debit here to work in process at 200,000, compare it to your production, and add to it your production volume variance here, debit amount of 40,000. That brings you up to 240,000. And then moving over to your debit here for your spending variance, 2,500. So the total amount here in your debits adds up to 242,500. Same as you have for your actual cost here, 242,500. But that was just based on our production volume variance as a whole here. Now we can break this production volume variance down, and let's look at that. We can break it down between our planned production and our unplanned production. That's what we're looking at as a volume variance. So let's look at case A here, our planned production. This is where we would take those denominator hours, those total 4,800 hours that we're looking at it, and compare it to the budgeted hours here, 4,420 hours. So in the difference here, we would take times our standard fixed overhead rate of $50 per hour. So that is going to give us of $19,000. We're going to have a debit here of $19,000. Again, unfavorable because our budgeted hours here for the period of 4,420 is less than our total denominator hours here, 4,800. So that's where we get up, break it up here for our planned production. That equals $19,000. And then the unplanned production, that's simply taking your budgeted hours here again. This is where the 4,420 hours, and compare it to the standard hours allowed here for our standard of 4,000 hours. So there's a difference here of 420 hours. Budgeted hours are 420 hours more than our standard hours allowed. Again, you take it times your standard fixed overhead rate here of $50. That's going to give you $21,000 here. Again, an unfavorable unfavorable amount here. Anytime you're debiting something, it's an unfavorable amount, because in this case, our budgeted hours here that we have for the period 4,420 is greater than the standard hours allowed here, 4,000. So here's a case where you have your planned variance here, 19,000, unfavorable, and your unplanned variance here, production variance here, volume variance we're looking at 21,000. So you can see the 19,000 here, unfavorable, plus the 21,000 here, unfavorable again, equals the total 40,000 here if we go up and look at it. So our production volume variance, 40,000 here, unfavorable, broken down as planned production volume variance, 19,000 unfavorable, plus the 21,000 here of the planned production variance here, a volume variance of 19,000 versus our unplanned production variance here of 21,000. So 19,000 plus 21,000 equals our production volume variance here, 40,000 that we looked at. So that's how you break them down here between your planned production versus your unplanned production volume variance. And again, the total amounts that we've looked at here, if we gone back, we were looking at that total amount here of, actually, let's look at it here. Total amount here was the 40,000 here of that production variance, the 19,000 here plus the 21,000 unplanned, versus, and also looking at that $2,500 fixed spending variance. Total variance adds up to 42,500. So just remember here, this BH, that was our budgeted hours for the planned production. In this case, we had 4,420 budgeted hours for the planned production, and the DH here was those total budgeted hours we had for the period of 4,800. So that's where we, and for our planned production volume variance, that we were comparing our total budgeted direct labor hours to the budget hours for the planned production times the standard fixed overhead rate here, $50. Equal to 19,000 here. And then the unplanned production volume variance, that was simply taking the budgeted hours that was planned for the total budgeted hours, or excuse me, the budget hours here planned for the production here, 4,400, comparing it to the standard hours allowed here, 4,000. So the difference times your standard fixed overhead rate here, $50 per hour, gave you your unplanned volume production volume variance here, 21,000. Okay, so that's how we broke down this production volume variance here, that 40,000. We broke it down, the total production volume variance here, 40,000. That was our total budgeted direct labor hours minus the, or compared to the standard hours allocated times your standard fixed cost, and that was our total amount that we're looking at. We were able to break it down here between our planned production volume variance of 19,000 here in the unplanned production variance here of 21,000. Okay, so that's taking care of our planned versus our unplanned production variance. Okay, just to follow up to our planned and our unplanned production volume variances here. So if we look at our T accounts here, where we start out with our work in process here, the standard cost that we calculated here to be $200,000 for our fixed overhead costs here, and compare it to that budgeted amount here for our production, that based on those total 4,800 hours that we had for the period here times the standard variable overhead rate here of $50 per hour, that gave us that $240,000 amount. So the difference of 40,000 here, that was the total production volume variance that we were looking at. Now if we go and we look at the planned production, that was that $50 here standard variable overhead rate times the actual budgeted hours here, 4,420. That gave us that 221,000 here. That was our planned production. So the difference between the 240,000 here, our original budgeted amount, versus what we had for our planned production here, 221,000, is $19,000. And that's what we calculated to be our planned volume variance, the planned production volume variance. And then the difference between our standard cost here, 200,000, versus what we have for our planned production here at 221,000 is 21,000, and that was our unplanned volume variance. Just to make that point here. So in either case, in all cases here, you can see we have an unfavorable volume variance, because what we had budgeted here at 240,000 is greater than our standard cost here at 200,000, and then it was split up between the 19,000 here of our planned production volume variance and the 21,000 here for the unplanned production volume variance. Okay, so that's what we're looking at here, just in looking at our T accounts here, looking at our standard cost versus our original budgeted amount for the production here versus what we had for our planned production. Okay, so that'll continue end our discussion.